Well, welcome back, everybody. This time, Chapter 7, Budgeting, which means estimating costs and the associated risks. We'll do the same with schedule. We'll estimate the schedule with the associated risks as well. Now, from a budgeting perspective, we want to account for the resources. Those resources then built into the budget become a constraint on the project. The budget says I can only do so much schedule and so much scope and mitigate so many risks, etc. And so this is something that we'll want to focus on, right? The nice thing about having a budget in your charter initially is that it, one, says that management supports your effort because management signs the charter, the sponsor formally, with you, the project manager. So you'll want to have that there. Remember, there's the business documents, and then you'll refine it down to the charter, and then further refine the budget in planning. So it's at a high level in the charter, but it says there's management support. And with that, you'll already want to begin to define some control mechanism, right? I would start with corporate policies and work with human resources on spending, how much you can put on the company card, what types of things, that sort of thing. That begins to start your control mechanism for budgeting. Now, when you do estimate a budget, you'll always want to consider the material you'll use, like steel, the labor, and then the equipment to move the material, perhaps, like steel, if you're building a building, the capital investment up front to cover other costs, overhead, like an administrative assistant, or and then the profit. If you're going to bid with on another company's project, that's what the bid is about, and you definitely want to include all of these topics in your budget, including profit. I normally know profits run about 8 to 9% in a small business. In a larger business, maybe 20%. But whatever your profit is, make sure that you include it along with your resources in your budget if you're going to bid, right? And once we're done with that and the bid's been accepted, then we just forecast to make sure we stay on target. So, like any forecast, it includes some uncertainty. Remember, that means it includes risk. We said last week, we discussed that risk, by its shortest definition, is an uncertainty. We just don't know yet whether it's a threat or an opportunity, and we want to develop those and understand those. So we want to take those uncertainties from the business documents to the charter, which is still a high-level budget, kind of loose, gives you a limit down to the planning, where you eliminate some uncertainty and create more truisms out of it, okay, especially for labor and material. You want to try and control those costs while you control your project deliverable. So there's some rules of thumb. For example, in construction, they often use the price per square foot, right? That's a common rule of thumb. That's called a parametric estimate. And then maybe the printing by the number of cost by the number of pages. Maybe the lawn care by the square foot of a lawn. So when you go out to estimate how much you would charge somebody to do their lawn, you already have an estimate for your bid based per square foot, based on the materials, based on overhead, based on profit, etc., that we already talked about. Okay, so these are some budgeting concepts that we'll go through next. And so we do estimating deliberately because it can be challenging, right? If you want some historical information, that's sometimes available, but it's generally considered not accurate. In fact, it would be considered a ROM budget, or rough order of magnitude budget. Okay, that would be historical. So even if the projects are similar, because things change. Remember, the very definition of a project is that it's unique in its deliverable and time bound. So it's never, even though it's similar, it's never going to be exactly the same. So that will lead to some uncertainties. And of course, multiple people will have some control over the budget, right, at various levels. And there is sometimes flexibility regarding the inputs that creates some of that control also. You know, I'm going to pad my estimates that some process owners will say. And as a project manager, we generally reject that. We want to know. We understand it may not be exact, but we want to know what we think on the outset it should be. And if it's not that in the end, we'll do lessons learned, right? And then we'll want to set up an accounting system to make sure we track the spend. And that's usually done in the work breakdown structure that we talked about last week, right? And then we also want to have a burn down chart to understand the use of our labor and material over time to make sure we're not going to run out early. Now, types of budgeting are generally top down, bottom up, or even negotiated along the way. Now, a top-down budget is most common, and it's usually done with a work breakdown structure where I add control accounts, anything you want, a specific number to each box in the work breakdown structure that we looked at last week, and that will help you control and manage your accounts, right? And we sometimes see this as a zero-sum game approach, okay? It has advantages, and the advantages largely, you can pause and review, outweigh the disadvantages, right? It may get difficult to get buy-in, but oftentimes when we work in a commercial company, we are issued our budget regardless of what our input is. So people will buy in overall. Okay? Now, there's also bottom-up estimating covered well in the literature, so make sure you go through that. Because I want to touch now on two types of reserve analysis, contingency reserve and management reserve. There are only two types, and both are listed here. Now, a contingency reserve is for what we call known unknowns. We know the risk exists, whether it's a threat or an opportunity. We just don't know if the risk will happen. And the project manager plans against that and usually sets some money aside to accommodate budget or schedule needs later on if the risk happens. Now, management reserve is not something the project manager controls. Management reserve, in fact, is something the project manager is probably unaware of. And the management reserves, the project manager will, or the management above us will probably set some aside. I used to do this at one of my last positions. When I had a project budget, I would take about 12%, and I'd go talk to the budget person and carve out a set aside of about 12% for things that we didn't realize. And those are called unknown unknowns. We didn't see the risk happening or coming, and so we could not plan against it. So contingency reserve is about known unknowns, and you, the project manager, own those. And management reserves are for unknown unknowns along the way. And there are advantages to that and disadvantages, but I'm going to go with the advantages and say you want to do contingency reserves for your highest risks in the project. Now, we can estimate costs in various ways. One is at the work element costing, where the labor rate will include any overhead that goes with them and personal time, like vacation time, right? So your labor rate isn't just, we pay Joe $80 an hour, so we pay Joe $80 an hour, and Joe has these benefits that cost us money per hour, and Joe needs vacation time too, which has a cost to it. Okay, so you want to make sure you accommodate those. Also, you want to look at direct costs, right? Direct costs do not usually include overhead. Those are things that directly go into building your project. If a piece of steel material is going to be part of a support beam, that's a direct cost on a project and would not have overhead, right? And of course, you will always have some sort of administrative charges to your project, right? And so they do some estimation examples. You're welcome to review those in the book. It's worth your time, but they're fairly simple to walk through. Now, an iterative budget process is really negotiation in action. It's one of the reasons that we covered negotiation early on up front. If you recall, I recommended the book Getting to Yes. Highly recommended for your own reading. Very short, but very worthwhile. So anyhow, it's a conversation you have with senior leadership, with functional managers that we talked about in a matrix type organization. And so most projects are a combination of top-down and bottom-up budgeting and doing that within a matrix type organization, as we discussed last week. In the end, your budget usually results, a typical project budget will look like this S curve on the left, where, you just don't start out the gate running with your full project team, right? You build your team, you collect them over time. It takes time to stand up and get going, to turn on the lights and get things moving. And that's why it shallows at the very beginning. And then most of your work is done here in the middle of the S curve. This is where you're executing your project. A lot of momentum. And usually you're slow to finish because you're starting to release people to go back to their other matrixed roles. And as the project finishes out and you close it out. And so you'll want to make sure the project is the only baseline that is known as a time phased. So notice the time across the horizontal axis at the bottom. So you'll want to have your budget by quarter, by year, depending on what you decide to break it down into. That's neat. And manage your budget in a time phased approach as you complete your project. So according to this, at about 80% of my project, I should have it done in this amount of time, whatever unit we decided to give that on the vertical axis. Okay, so now one of the things that's going to help you with your budgeting approach is to break out line items. So if you have to eliminate something, you know exactly what it is, or add something in. And a way to organize your line items in the budget is to organize them around categories, right? Categories help us go, okay, what about the interior of the house? That's all the budget we have left. Let's look at that, right? And so you can organize by categories, very useful, right? And so here's a snapshot from the literature on a typical monthly budget and how it's broken down by notice management, operating expenses, travel, and professional fees, etc. And then, of course, here's your time-phased budget. You can see your total budget down here and how much by month we expect to spend, and the estimates for the various tasks in the vertical and how much each month that we're going to use. This should match with your schedule and your work breakdown structure along the way. Okay, and then we'll want to make sure that we can improve the cost of estimating as well. Now, when we estimate costs, we want it to be exact. We do not want it to be padded because we know it'll still be off. We want it to be exact, and we want to write down at each level why that decision was made. And because we want to learn lessons if it isn't done right in the end. It's not about blame. Now, I would say most firms add 5 to 10% for management reserves. For contingencies, that's something you, the project manager, will have to work through. If you don't have any high-level risks with a large impact and a large probability, you may have none along the way. And so there are learning curves to consider also in your estimate. We don't just walk out the door knowing everything, but we'll make fewer mistakes over time, and that's a learning curve. We want to accommodate that in our budget. We'll stop here and come back with part 2 of this chapter.